When I first saw him flipping through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not because I feared he might discover the truth, but because I knew the messages I had forgotten to delete would be the ones he would see. I tried to grab the phone from his hands, but he pulled it away so quickly, continuing to scroll. I stood there, watching his face change as he read line after line, feeling as though my life was collapsing in real time. Yes, he was about to find out the truth, but not all of it. His hands trembled as he flipped further, and I knew that this was the moment when he would stumble upon the message that would ruin everything. The one that would explain everything and put an end to it all, or perhaps, leave him even more confused. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I saw his face drain of color as he read the sender's name. He froze. Not even a blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I was nervous. My nerves mixed with the horror of what I had done. His breath quickened. I could hear it even from 2 meters away. This was exactly what I had feared the most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake that changed everything, and now I didn't know what to do. But let me take you back to the beginning, before I share with you the secret I've been trying so hard to keep hidden all this time. But first, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and answer this question. Have you ever had a secret you tried to hide with everything you had, but in the end, it all came crashing down? The morning was like any other, but something had shifted in the air. It wasn't visible, nor was it audible, but it was there. A quiet tension that lingered between us, unnoticed by my husband, but ever present to me. I had woken up earlier than usual, the room still dim with the first light of day. The familiar sound of his breathing next to me was both soothing and suffocating. His presence was there, but the connection between us had faded long ago. The house felt still as I moved quietly around the kitchen. I hadn't planned on making breakfast. It wasn't necessary anymore. I was going through the motions, preparing the usual things. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee. The ritual we had built over the years, a ritual that used to mean something, but now felt as empty as the space between us. I had forgotten what it felt like to truly care about breakfast. It wasn't the meal itself, it was the company, the shared moments. The laughter that used to come so easily. But now? Now it was a chore. A duty. I made my way to the table, setting down the plates with a sigh that only I could hear. I didn't have to look up to know he wasn't paying attention. His eyes were fixed on the phone in his hands, flicking through the news, his thumb lazily scrolling across the screen. His face was indifferent, his mind elsewhere. I cleared my throat, a small, subconscious attempt to bring him back into the room. "How was your meeting last night?" I asked, the question feeling foreign in my mouth. He barely glanced up, his eyes flickering to mine for just a second before returning to the glowing screen. "Fine," he muttered. "Busy. The usual." His response was cold, detached. There was a time when he would have asked about my day, even if it was just a polite gesture. But now, the conversation had withered. We were two strangers sharing a home, moving through our lives in parallel, without any real connection. I pushed my food around on my plate, unable to find the appetite for it. I felt the weight of the silence pressing in on me, the absence of anything meaningful in our conversations. He was still absorbed in the phone, and I could feel myself slipping further into the background of his life, just a shadow of the woman I used to be. "I think we need a break," I said before I could stop myself. The words escaped me in a rush, unplanned but inevitable. The truth of them hung in the air, thick and heavy. He looked up this time, his brow furrowing slightly. "A break? What do you mean?" "A break from everything. From the routine. From the distance. From this," I gestured between us, the words failing me as they often did when I tried to explain the feeling that had been consuming me for so long. He set the phone down, the first real interaction we had in days. His eyes met mine, but they lacked the warmth they once held. He looked at me, but I could tell he wasn't really seeing me. "You're overthinking this. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. I knew it, and deep down, I think he did too. It had been too long since we had been more than just two people living under the same roof. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, but it was followed by the same old indifference. He wasn't ready to face it. He never had been. I stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back with more force than I intended. "I'm not overthinking it. We're not even talking anymore. It's like, we're just existing next to each other." He didn't respond immediately, the silence stretching between us. Finally, he sighed, the sound of his frustration cutting through the air. "I don't know what you want from me." What I wanted. I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure what I wanted from him, from myself, from this life we had built together. But there was one thing I knew for certain: I couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore. I left the room without another word, the weight of the conversation lingering behind me like a heavy cloak. It wasn't a solution, but it was a step. A small, insignificant step, but a step nonetheless. I spent the rest of the day alone, lost in my thoughts, the house as silent as ever. When I heard the familiar sound of the front door opening, I didn't jump to my feet like I used to. I didn't rush to greet him. He came in, dropping his briefcase by the door, and we exchanged the usual pleasantries. "How was your day?" he asked absently, his voice sounding distant, like he was already thinking about something else. "It was fine," I replied, the words slipping out like a well-rehearsed line. There was no more excitement in my voice, no more hope for change. That evening, when he went to bed, I stayed up longer than usual. I could feel the tension building inside of me, the restlessness gnawing at my insides. I glanced at my phone, the notification blinking at me like a warning sign. It was a message from him. His name flashed across the screen, and for a moment, I froze. My finger hovered over the screen, and my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. I hadn't intended to get involved with him. I hadn't meant for this to happen. But it had. And now, it was too late to turn back. As I unlocked my phone, I saw the message that would change everything. The words were simple, innocent even, but they hit me like a wave crashing against the shore. I read it, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they made me feel, the way they made me feel seen, heard, and wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. I set the phone down, my heart racing. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. I knew I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't take back. And I had no idea what to do next. But I couldn't stop myself from thinking, what if this was the change I needed? What if this was the answer I had been searching for all along? As I lay in bed that night, the darkness pressing in around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had already been set into motion. There was no going back now. And so, the story began. The next few days passed like slow-moving shadows, the quiet stretching between us until it became almost unbearable. It wasn't that anything had changed dramatically, but something inside me had shifted. The tension that had been quietly building up in the house had become something I could no longer ignore. My conversations with my husband had grown increasingly superficial, the silences between us thicker, more charged with unspoken words. I found myself searching for something, anything, that might fill the void that seemed to have taken over our lives. I told myself it was a phase, that we were just going through a rough patch. We had been married for years, and every marriage had its ups and downs, didn't it? But it felt like something much deeper than a mere disagreement or a passing moment of frustration. It was as if we were strangers living in the same house, both pretending to be someone we were no longer. My husband, ever the creature of routine, had his own way of dealing with things. He buried himself in work, as always, his meetings and late nights at the office becoming more frequent. He didn't seem to notice the distance between us. Or perhaps he did, but didn't know how to bridge it. That morning, he had left for work before I even woke up. His absence was becoming a pattern. I couldn't remember the last time we had shared a real moment together. It was all so normal. And that was the problem. The normalcy of it was suffocating. I had decided to spend the day doing something that might take my mind off things. I went to the market, something that usually felt mundane but had started to feel like a small act of rebellion. It was a way to step out of the house, away from the suffocating stillness, and into the world. The air smelled fresh, the colors of the produce vibrant, and for a brief moment, I felt something stir inside me. It was there, in the middle of the market, that I saw him again. It wasn't intentional, but there he was, my husband's cousin. I hadn't expected to run into him, but in that moment, the world felt a little bit smaller. He was standing by a stall, his eyes scanning the selection of tomatoes, his fingers brushing lightly against the fruit. I had forgotten how tall he was, how effortlessly he seemed to occupy space. He noticed me before I could react. His face lit up with that familiar, warm smile that had always made me feel like I mattered, even when everything else seemed to fade into the background. "Hey there," he said, his voice warm and easy, like no time had passed at all. I smiled back, a little too quickly. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Just picking up a few things for my place," he said, glancing at the bag in his hand. "I didn't realize you were still living in the area. How's everything?" His question lingered in the air longer than I expected. "Everything's fine," I said, but even I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. I wanted to say more, wanted to tell him how everything felt hollow and empty, but I didn't. Instead, I smiled again, a tight, rehearsed smile that barely reached my eyes. "That's good to hear," he said, though I wasn't sure if he believed me. He was good at reading people, or maybe he just knew me too well. We had always had this unspoken connection, one that had never been quite like anything I had with anyone else. The conversation drifted from the mundane to more personal topics, how I had been spending my days, how work was going, how life had been treating us. It was all small talk, but there was a certain ease between us, something that felt genuine and real. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. As we continued talking, I felt myself slipping into the rhythm of the conversation, the weight of the world lightening with each word. He had that effect on me. It wasn't just his charm or his easy smile, it was the way he made me feel seen, as if I mattered in ways that I had long forgotten. I hadn't even realized how close we had gotten until his hand brushed against mine. It was light, a simple touch, but it sent a shock through me. I froze for a moment, the warmth of his hand lingering on mine. I could feel my heart beat faster, and I didn't know why. It wasn't anything significant. It was just a touch. A casual brush of the fingers. But something shifted inside me. I pulled my hand away quickly, almost too quickly, as if the simple act of contact had startled me. I felt foolish for reacting so strongly to something so innocent, but the feeling lingered. I tried to ignore it, to push it down, but it was there, alive and pulsing in the space between us. He didn't seem to notice my discomfort. He smiled, his eyes glinting with a warmth that made me feel exposed in ways I wasn't ready to acknowledge. "I'd like to catch up more," he said, his voice lower now, almost as if the words themselves were a secret. "Maybe over coffee sometime. I've got some free time this weekend. How about you?" I nodded, though a part of me hesitated. I had no reason to say no, no reason to turn down the invitation. But another part of me, something deep inside, knew that saying yes might lead me down a path I wasn't sure I was ready to walk. But at that moment, it didn't matter. "I'd like that," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He smiled again, that same easy smile that always made me feel like I was the only person in the room. "Great. I'll text you. We'll figure it out." As we said our goodbyes and I watched him walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That small, seemingly insignificant moment had unlocked something within me. The connection between us had always been there, but now, it felt different. It felt real. I returned home, the echo of the encounter still lingering in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way he had looked at me, the way his touch had sent a ripple through me, the way it all seemed so simple, yet so charged with meaning. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure: things were no longer the same. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to focus on anything for too long. My thoughts kept drifting back to him, to that brief moment in the market, to the way I felt when we spoke. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. It was just a touch, just a conversation. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. That night, when my husband came home, I could barely look at him. The silence between us felt more pronounced than ever. He kissed me on the cheek as he always did, his touch absent and mechanical. And I let him, because that was what I was supposed to do. But inside, I was miles away. My thoughts were with someone else. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew that whatever had started between us, whatever had awakened in me, was something I couldn't ignore. The days that followed felt like they were suspended in time. Every moment seemed to drag on, yet in the quiet moments of reflection, they passed far too quickly. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't that anything overt had happened, but the smallest shift, an innocent conversation, a fleeting touch, had awakened something inside of me that I couldn't ignore. It was as if a door had been opened, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bring myself to close it. The encounter at the market had stayed with me, more than I cared to admit. It wasn't just the conversation, though that had been pleasant enough, it was the way he made me feel. I had spent so long feeling invisible in my own life, but with him, for just a moment, I had felt seen. His smile, the warmth in his eyes, the way he seemed to genuinely care about how I was doing, it was a stark contrast to the cold indifference I had been living with. And that made me question everything. Was it wrong to crave that attention, to want to be wanted in a way I hadn't been in years? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how distant I had become from my own desires. The last few years had been a blur of routine, of trying to maintain the facade of a perfect marriage, while the connection between my husband and me slowly eroded. We had become two people passing each other in the hallways of our own lives, saying the right things, doing the right things, but never really looking at each other. I had started to wonder if that was all it was ever meant to be: comfort, stability, and the security of knowing someone was always there, even if they weren't truly there. It wasn't like I didn't care about my husband anymore. I did. But I had come to realize that I had lost myself along the way. I had become a wife, a mother, a caretaker, and in doing so, I had forgotten who I was as an individual. I wasn't the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. I wasn't even sure if I knew who she was anymore. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the tasks in front of me. There was always something to do: laundry, cleaning, cooking, the endless list of things that needed to be taken care of. But no matter how much I threw myself into these tasks, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was missing. I couldn't escape the pull that was growing stronger with each passing day. That Friday afternoon, when my husband left for his usual late meeting, I found myself standing by the window, staring out into the street. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I knew that I was waiting for something. I felt restless, caught between the life I had built and the life that seemed just out of reach, a life that had become real in the brief moments I had spent with him, the cousin, the stranger who wasn't really a stranger. The knock on the door broke me from my thoughts, and I hesitated for a moment before going to answer. When I opened it, there he was, my husband's cousin, standing on the doorstep with a casual smile. He was holding a bag of groceries, as if he had just stopped by for a quick chat. "Hey," he said, his voice light. "I thought I'd bring over a few things. You mentioned you were running low on some stuff." I blinked, surprised. I hadn't expected him to actually follow through on the coffee invite, though I couldn't deny that a part of me had hoped he would. I stepped aside to let him in, feeling the familiar knot of anticipation tighten in my chest. "Thanks," I said, my voice a little too breathless, though I didn't know why. "You didn't have to." "It's no trouble," he replied, stepping inside and setting the bag on the kitchen counter. "Besides, I'm always up for a good chat." I nodded, trying to appear calm, but the air between us felt charged in a way I hadn't expected. There was something undeniably magnetic about the way he carried himself, the way he seemed so comfortable in his own skin. It made me realize just how disconnected I had become from my own sense of self. He turned to face me, his eyes meeting mine with that same unspoken understanding I had sensed before. "How have you been?" "Really?" I swallowed, the words catching in my throat. I wasn't sure I was ready to admit the truth, to admit how much I had been craving something more, something real. But I couldn't lie to him. Not now. "I've been fine," I said, forcing a smile. But the smile felt hollow, like a mask that didn't quite fit. "Just the usual." He studied me for a moment, his expression softening. "It doesn't look like just the usual. You don't seem fine." His words hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't used to being seen like this, to having someone look at me and actually notice. It felt both unnerving and strangely comforting at the same time. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, I found myself looking at him, really looking at him, for the first time since he had walked in. "I guess I've just been feeling a little lost," I finally admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded as though he understood, as though he had heard this same thing from so many others. But there was something different in the way he looked at me now, something that made the air feel thicker between us. "I get it," he said softly. "I think we all feel like that sometimes." I nodded, unable to find the right words to respond. I was aware of the closeness between us now, the way our bodies seemed to be drawn together without either of us acknowledging it. The tension in the room was palpable, and I couldn't ignore it. I could feel it in my chest, in the way my pulse quickened whenever he was near, in the way my thoughts scattered whenever he spoke. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for the coffee mugs on the counter. The touch was so casual, so innocent, but it sent a ripple through me, a jolt of awareness that I wasn't sure how to handle. I pulled my hand away quickly, almost too quickly, but he didn't seem to notice. He just smiled, that same easy smile that always made me feel like I was the only person in the room. He poured the coffee, the sound of the liquid filling the mugs filling the silence between us. We sat at the table, each of us holding our mugs, the tension still lingering in the air, unspoken but undeniable. I tried to focus on the conversation, on the small talk that we exchanged, but my mind kept drifting back to that touch, to the way he made me feel like I mattered. It was a dangerous feeling, one that I knew I shouldn't entertain, but I couldn't help myself. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted, and we found ourselves talking about everything and nothing at the same time. It was easy to talk to him, easy to let my guard down in a way I hadn't been able to do with anyone in years. He listened, really listened, as though my words held weight, as though they mattered. I caught myself laughing, really laughing for the first time in a long time. It felt good. Too good. And that's when I knew I was in deeper than I cared to admit. Eventually, the conversation slowed, and the weight of the silence settled between us once more. He stood up, gathering his things to leave. But before he reached the door, he paused, turning to look at me one last time. "Take care of yourself, okay?" he said, his voice low, but filled with something unspoken. "You deserve to be happy." His words hung in the air long after he left. I stood there, in the quiet aftermath, the warmth of the coffee still lingering in my hands, and wondered what would happen next. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was beginning to wonder if I was ready to find out. The following morning began as many others had before it, quiet, muted, and emotionally distant. But this time, I noticed how different I felt. There was a strange sense of weightlessness in my chest, though it was accompanied by a dull, constant unease, like standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to jump or retreat. I moved through the house like I was retracing old steps, following the path I had walked for years, but now each room felt unfamiliar, as if the walls had heard something they weren't supposed to. I found myself avoiding mirrors. I couldn't face the reflection that might betray the confusion I carried. My husband had already left for the office, leaving behind the usual cold remnants of routine, an untouched cup of coffee, a folded newspaper, and the faint scent of aftershave that lingered long after the man himself had disappeared. These remnants had once meant comfort. Now, they felt like footprints in dust. I kept busy, or tried to. The laundry was folded more neatly than necessary. The counters were wiped twice, even though they were already clean. I organized drawers that hadn't been touched in months, each item a memory I wasn't ready to hold. I thought that if I kept my hands moving, maybe my thoughts would slow down, maybe the knot in my stomach would loosen. But nothing worked. Later in the afternoon, I received a text from my husband. It was brief, just a note to say he'd be home late and that he hoped I'd have dinner ready. No question about my day. No affection. Just another transaction in the quiet economy of our marriage. I stared at the screen for a while before placing the phone face down. I didn't reply. The hours crawled toward the evening. I wasn't hungry, but I cooked anyway, something simple, familiar. The act of preparing a meal had always been one of care, a small service I offered him, a way to maintain some thread of intimacy when the rest had unraveled. But now, it felt like I was just filling time, going through the motions for someone who no longer truly noticed. As the food simmered, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, I hesitated. My heart beat faster, even though I told myself it was probably nothing, someone delivering mail, or a neighbor. But deep down, I already knew. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked slowly to the door, trying to maintain control over my breath, my expression, everything. When I opened it, there he was. He stood there, hands in his coat pockets, eyes searching mine with something that looked like uncertainty and something else, regret, maybe. I hadn't seen him since our conversation in the kitchen, but I had thought about him constantly. Now that he was here, I wasn't sure what to do. "I was just in the neighborhood," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes didn't match the words. I didn't believe him, and I knew he didn't expect me to. I stepped aside without speaking, letting him in. We moved to the living room, and for a few minutes, we sat in silence. It wasn't awkward, exactly. It was thick, charged with the weight of what hadn't been said the last time we were together. The air between us felt different now. Something had shifted, subtle but irreversible. I was aware of his presence in a way that made my skin feel tight. Not from fear, not from shame, but from something deeper. A longing that I had buried for years. A hunger to be understood, not as a wife or a hostess or a caretaker, but simply as myself. He looked around the room slowly, his gaze settling on the framed photographs on the mantel, wedding pictures, family gatherings, smiling faces frozen in time. I watched his expression, trying to read what he saw. But his face remained neutral, respectful. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said after a moment. "You're not," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. I wasn't used to sharing this space with someone who wasn't my husband. The room felt smaller, more intimate. We talked, at first about nothing, his work, the weather, something forgettable on the news. But beneath the surface of each sentence was a tension we both pretended not to notice. It was exhausting, dancing around the truth. I was tired of pretending. Tired of burying my thoughts under polite conversation. Finally, I asked him why he came. He paused, then answered with a quiet honesty that caught me off guard. "I don't know. I guess I just wanted to see you again." There it was. The words hung in the space between us, honest and simple. And I didn't know how to respond. My instinct was to retreat, to change the subject, to protect the fragile shell I had spent years building around myself. But instead, I let the silence stretch. He didn't move closer. He didn't try to reach for me. He just sat there, waiting, as if he knew I needed time to decide what I would say next. I told him I felt like I had been holding my breath for years. That everything in my life had become so carefully managed, so quietly restrained, that I had forgotten how to feel anything outside of what was expected of me. That lately, something had started to wake up inside me, and it terrified me. He didn't offer advice. He didn't try to fix it. He just listened. And in that silence, I felt more seen than I had in a very long time. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more. But he didn't. He simply looked at me with that same quiet understanding and nodded. And then, we kissed. It was brief. No words, no pretense, just a moment of clarity in a sea of confusion. The kind of kiss that doesn't demand, doesn't promise, but simply exists. A point of no return, maybe. Or maybe just a reflection of what was already true. He left without another word. I closed the door behind him and stood in the quiet house, the ticking of the clock suddenly loud in my ears. The dinner had gone cold on the stove. I didn't reheat it. Instead, I walked into the living room, sat down on the couch, and let the silence wrap around me. It wasn't comforting. But it was real. I knew this would change things. I didn't know how, or when, or to what extent, but I knew the balance of my life had shifted. The image I had been trying to protect was cracking. And I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening anymore. The question now wasn't whether I had crossed a line. It was whether I could live with the version of myself I had become. And whether I even wanted to go back. The kiss lingered in my mind like the scent of something sweet and fleeting. It had been brief, but it held the weight of everything unspoken between us. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed next to my husband, his steady breathing a rhythmic reminder of how far apart we had drifted. I stared at the ceiling for hours, my thoughts turning over and over like a tide I couldn't control. I wasn't someone who acted impulsively. My life had been defined by careful choices, by being measured, responsible, reliable. I was the one who held things together, even when they were fraying. But in that single moment, when our lips met, I had stepped outside the person I thought I was. And the worst part wasn't that it had happened. The worst part was how natural it had felt. The next morning came too quickly. My husband left early again, as he often did on weekends now, always finding excuses, golf with colleagues, early errands, a meeting that couldn't wait. I didn't ask questions. I hadn't for a long time. There had been a time when I would have gently teased him, asked for details, but now we both treated these departures like ordinary necessities, no different from brushing our teeth or folding laundry. I watched him from the kitchen window as he pulled away from the driveway. The air was still cool, the garden still damp with dew. I stood there, holding my coffee, the warmth of the mug grounding me for a moment. The quiet in the house felt different now, less peaceful, more like something pressing in on me, waiting for me to acknowledge it. A few hours later, he called. It wasn't my husband. It was him. His voice was calm, soft, careful. He asked if I was free, said he had something he wanted to show me. I should have said no. I should have made an excuse. But the truth was, I had already decided before the words even left his mouth. We met near the old walking trail behind the community garden. It was a place I hadn't visited in years, though we used to go there often when we were younger, before routines had replaced spontaneity, before the world had dulled around the edges. He was already there when I arrived, leaning against the railing of the footbridge that overlooked the creek. He greeted me with a smile that didn't try too hard, and for that, I was grateful. I didn't need grand gestures. I just needed something real. We walked for a while without speaking. The trees above us swayed gently, leaves falling like lazy confetti. The sound of our footsteps on the gravel path was the only thing breaking the silence. I was aware of how close he was beside me, the rhythm of his stride matching mine, the occasional brush of our arms when the path narrowed. Eventually, he turned off the trail and led us to a quiet spot, a bench tucked beneath a large elm tree. We sat down, still not speaking. He didn't push. He didn't ask questions. He simply sat with me, and somehow that made it easier to breathe. I didn't plan for any of this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. You know that, right? He nodded. Neither did I. The words were enough. We didn't need to rehash the moment. It had happened. It couldn't be undone, but it didn't need to be justified either. What mattered more was what we chose to do next. I stared out at the creek below, the water slow and reflective. Everything in my life had been so still for so long, but now it felt like I was standing in the middle of a current, being pulled in a direction I didn't entirely understand. I've spent so long pretending that everything was fine, I said, the words coming more freely now. That I didn't need more. That this was just how life is after a certain point. He didn't interrupt. He let me speak. But lately, I've started to wonder if I've just accepted too little for too long. There was another long silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of recognition, of quiet understanding that didn't require explanation. I don't want to hurt anyone, I added, more to myself than to him. But I don't know how to keep living like this. He finally looked at me, his gaze steady. You deserve to feel alive. That's not a crime. I didn't respond. I didn't know how. The truth was, I hadn't felt alive in years, not truly. And now that I had tasted it again, I didn't know how to go back to the version of me that had learned to live without it. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around us. I closed my eyes for a moment and just listened to the wind, to the birds, to the world that had always been there, waiting for me to notice it again. We stood to leave not long after, but before we parted ways, we turned toward each other in quiet agreement, as if some silent decision had already been made. We kissed. It was different this time. Still brief. Still simple. But it carried more weight, not because it was more passionate, but because it was more certain. There was no hesitation. No apology. Just acknowledgement. A line crossed, fully and without pretense. When I returned home, the house greeted me with its usual stillness. The clock ticked in the hallway. A beam of afternoon light stretched across the kitchen tiles. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I sat on the edge of the couch, unsure of what to do with myself. There were no immediate consequences to face, no confrontation waiting at the door. But inside, the shift had occurred. The questions I had avoided for so long now stood before me, no longer content to be ignored. What did I want? Who was I outside of my marriage, outside of this house? Could I live with the choices I was beginning to make? I didn't have the answers. But for the first time, I felt like I had permission to start asking. That evening, when my husband came home, I watched him move through the house with the same predictable rhythm. He placed his keys in the dish by the door. He checked his phone. He asked what was for dinner. I responded the way I always did, my voice even, my expression controlled. But something in me had changed. And I wasn't sure how long I could keep pretending that it hadn't. The days that followed moved both too slowly and far too fast. Each morning I woke to the same familiar house, the same filtered light coming through the curtains, the same steady rhythm of footsteps in the hallway as my husband moved through his morning routine. Nothing had changed on the surface. The routines remained untouched. But inside me, something had begun to splinter. There's a peculiar weight to a secret. It's not loud. It doesn't scream or demand attention. It simply sits there, quiet, constant, and deeply embedded. I carried mine with care, tucking it behind the smile I wore when I handed my husband his coffee, burying it under the casual phrases we exchanged at breakfast. I had become a master of small talk, of shifting conversations away from anything meaningful. The silence between us had always existed, but now it felt louder. I wasn't sure if he noticed. I didn't ask. And he didn't say. I kept myself busy, more out of necessity than habit. I told myself I had errands to run, laundry to fold, papers to organize, but these tasks were only distractions. There was no logic in organizing already sorted drawers, yet I did it anyway. I needed to keep moving, because when I stood still, the noise in my head became unbearable. I thought about him often, not just the moments we had shared, but the way he made me feel. Not in a way that was dramatic or impulsive, but in the quiet, everyday ways that mattered more than I ever realized. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the way I had laughed with him. The way I had spoken without filtering myself. The way I felt when he listened. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt like that. On Thursday morning, my husband mentioned that we were invited to a dinner party the following weekend. A colleague's birthday. He asked if I wanted to go, but the way he asked, without looking up from his phone, made it clear he didn't really care about my answer. It was just something to cross off a list. I said yes. Not because I wanted to go, but because I didn't want to explain why I didn't. After he left for work, I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time, still in my robe, hair unbrushed, staring at nothing in particular. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the living room clock. I thought about how many hours of my life I had spent in that silence, waiting for something to feel different. And now that it did, I wasn't sure what to do with it. Later that afternoon, I got a message from him. It was simple, just a suggestion to meet for coffee, same cafe as before. No pressure. No expectations. The message was brief, almost cautious, but I felt the undercurrent in the words. I stared at the screen for longer than necessary before replying. Yes. We met later that day. The cafe was quiet, tucked between a bookstore and a florist. It wasn't a place of significance, just a convenient meeting spot, but I knew I would never walk by it again without remembering everything it had come to represent. He was already there when I arrived. He stood as I approached, offering a small smile that was equal parts kind and uncertain. We ordered our drinks, sat near the window, and talked. Not about what had happened, not directly, but about everything that circled around it. The things we missed. The things we didn't say. The weight of being invisible for so long. He told me he was thinking of moving. A job offer in another city. Nothing confirmed, but the possibility was real. The kind of real that lingers in the background of a conversation, waiting for acknowledgement. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt a pang of panic, an irrational surge of loss at the thought of him leaving. The other part of me knew I had no claim on his choices. This was never supposed to be anything more than what it already was. But still, the idea of him not being here left a hollow space inside me that I couldn't quite explain. We left the cafe together, walking down the street with no real direction. The wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the sidewalk. I pulled my coat tighter around me, but it wasn't the cold that made me feel exposed. It was the knowledge that whatever this was, it had a time limit. He stopped walking at one point and turned to me. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said quietly. "I just didn't expect this." "Neither did I," I answered. That was the truth. I hadn't planned any of it. But sometimes things break through the surface of a quiet life and demand to be seen. We stood there for a long time. No one said anything. The city moved around us, people walking, cars passing, conversations floating past like echoes. But in that moment, the world felt still. Not frozen. Not cinematic. Just still. I knew I had to leave first. I couldn't let the moment stretch any further, or I wouldn't be able to walk away. I gave him a small nod, the kind that says everything without needing words. He understood. He always did. When I got home, the house was exactly as I had left it. The mail sat untouched by the door. The kitchen smelled faintly of detergent. The late afternoon sun spilled across the hallway, catching dust in the air. I stood in the middle of the room and let the quiet settle over me. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't sad, but because I wasn't sure what I was mourning yet. I went to the bedroom, changed into more comfortable clothes, and opened the windows. The cool air rushed in, sharp and clean. I stood there, breathing it in, trying to hold on to something that made sense. That evening, my husband came home earlier than usual. He looked tired. We talked over dinner, mostly about his day. I nodded in the right places, asked the right questions, and smiled when appropriate. We moved through the script, each of us playing our roles with precision. But something was different now. The words felt thinner. The smiles more rehearsed. And I wondered if he noticed. If he felt the distance, too. Or if he had simply grown comfortable with the space between us, the way I had, until recently. After dinner, he went to watch the news in the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes that didn't need to be cleaned again. My hands moved automatically, my mind elsewhere. There were no loud revelations. No arguments. No confessions. Just silence. But in that silence, something had changed. I was no longer waiting for life to return to what it had been. I was starting to understand that it never would. The following week passed in a haze, each day feeling both monotonous and charged with an underlying tension I couldn't shake. The house, though silent, seemed louder than ever, as though the walls themselves were aware of the growing distance between us. I went through the motions of my daily life, grocery shopping, cleaning, making dinner, but it all felt like I was simply playing a role. I wasn't living, not really. I was just waiting, though for what, I couldn't say. I had become acutely aware of my own movements, the way I would twist the handle of a door just a little too tightly, or how my breath would catch when my husband walked into the room. Everything felt amplified, as though the smallest thing could shatter the delicate veneer I had been trying to maintain. The house was still, but the silence between us had grown heavier. My husband, as usual, was immersed in his work, spending longer hours at the office or in his study at home. He never seemed to notice the emptiness that had settled in. Or perhaps he did, but it didn't matter to him as much as it mattered to me. One evening, after dinner, I sat on the couch while he watched a news broadcast on the television. I stared at the screen, but I wasn't really watching. My mind kept wandering back to him, the cousin, the one who had changed everything. I could feel my pulse quicken just at the thought of him, the way his words had lingered with me long after we had said goodbye. But I didn't know what to do with this newfound awareness of myself, this sense that I had been awoken from a sleep I hadn't even known I was in. I tried to push it aside, but it wasn't something I could easily ignore. And now, the more I tried, the more it seemed to pull me back in. I couldn't deny it. Something had shifted. When my husband turned off the TV and stood to leave the room, I felt an irrational urge to stop him. But I didn't. I simply watched as he walked out of the room, disappearing into the hallway that led to his office. There was no emotion in his actions, no urgency, no passion, just the quiet shuffle of routine. I sighed and stood up, stretching my arms above my head. I had learned to go through the motions, to pretend that nothing was wrong, but the strain of it was starting to show. I hadn't seen him, my husband, like I used to in so long. There had been a time when we laughed together, when we shared moments that felt full of meaning. But now, everything felt so distant, like we were two people coexisting in the same space without truly connecting. I couldn't continue like this. But what was I supposed to do? A knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. It was late, but I knew who it was before I even reached for the handle. I had been expecting him. There was no question that it was him. The cousin. The one who had, in a matter of weeks, turned my world upside down. I opened the door to find him standing there, his hands in his pockets, a quiet smile on his face. His presence was a comfort, but it also unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. He didn't need to say anything. I could tell by the way he looked at me that he knew exactly what I was feeling. It wasn't a look of pity, but one of understanding. He saw me, really saw me, in a way that no one else had in years. "I thought we could take a walk," he said, his voice low and steady. "Just for a few minutes." I hesitated. It wasn't the first time we'd met secretly, and each time it felt more dangerous than the last. But part of me didn't want to resist. The pull was undeniable. "Okay," I finally said, stepping aside to let him in. We didn't speak much as we walked down the quiet street. The evening air was crisp, the stars bright overhead. It was strange, how simple it all seemed, and yet how heavy it felt. We were both walking through this moment together, but neither of us could pretend that it wasn't complicated. The connection between us, the tension that had built up over the past few weeks, was impossible to ignore. He glanced over at me, his eyes meeting mine for a moment. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't the same as the way my husband looked at me, casual, distracted, as though there were nothing more to see. With him, it felt as though there was so much left unsaid. So many things we hadn't even begun to address. "I know this is confusing," he said after a long pause, his voice breaking the quiet. "But I need you to know that I'm not just here to cause trouble." I turned to look at him, trying to read his expression. "I don't think you're trying to cause trouble," I said softly. "But it doesn't make this any easier." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. But I think you already know that." The silence between us grew heavier. It wasn't just the physical distance between us now, though it felt like that. It was the emotional distance I was starting to close in on. The more time I spent with him, the more I realized that I wasn't living the life I wanted. I was simply surviving it. We walked further, the path narrowing as the trees on either side grew thicker, their branches almost intertwining above us. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground, the darkness more tangible here, as though the world outside this small pocket of solitude had forgotten us entirely. "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He stopped walking and turned to face me, his eyes serious, his expression softened by the dim light. You don't have to pretend anymore. I felt a lump form in my throat. But I don't know what's real anymore. He reached out and touched my arm, his fingers just brushing against my skin. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the world shifted beneath me. Everything in that moment, the uncertainty, the confusion, the desire to escape, seemed to collapse into the simple truth of that touch. I'm here, he said, his voice steady. Whatever happens, I'm here. I didn't know what he meant by that, and I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something other than the emptiness that had become my constant companion. The moment passed, as moments often do, and we stood there, side by side, under the weight of the night. The world outside continued on, oblivious to the quiet battle that was unfolding in this small corner of it. And in that silence, I realized something. The question wasn't whether I could keep living like this. The question was whether I wanted to. The morning came slowly, as mornings often do when something heavy weighs on your chest. I woke up early, as I always did, but this time the silence in the house felt different. It was deeper, more pronounced. I could feel it in the air, thick like fog, settling into the corners of every room. My husband had already left, no note, no goodbye. Just the usual routine, his shoes by the door, his briefcase left neatly by the entryway, his presence barely a trace. I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the dream that lingered in my mind. It had been strange, disjointed, but it was the kind of dream that stayed with you all day, even if you couldn't quite remember the details. I thought about him, the cousin, again. The way he looked at me, the way he made me feel seen when no one else had. I could still feel the weight of his gaze, the quiet understanding in his eyes. It was almost as if we had shared a secret, and now that secret was gnawing at me. I stood up, pushing aside the blankets, and walked to the window. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a soft light across the garden outside. The leaves on the trees were beginning to turn, the colors of fall slowly creeping in, as though the world was slowly changing, too. I wasn't sure what I expected to feel when I woke up today. Guilt, maybe. Confusion. Regret. But there was none of that. Instead, I felt a strange sort of peace, like I had finally acknowledged something I had been avoiding for far too long. I wasn't sure where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I went downstairs to make coffee, my movements automatic, my thoughts still tangled in the quiet chaos of the past few days. The kitchen was cold, the faint smell of yesterday's dinner still hanging in the air. I opened the fridge, grabbed the milk, and poured it into the pot, watching the steam rise as the coffee brewed. It was something I had done countless times before, but today it felt different. Today, I was doing it for myself, not for anyone else. The sound of the coffee machine filled the silence, a small comfort in an otherwise quiet house. I poured the coffee into a mug and took a sip, savoring the warmth as it spread through me. I should have been focused on the fact that my marriage was unraveling, that I was standing on the precipice of something irreversible. But instead, I thought about him again, the cousin, and the way he had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. The doorbell rang, startling me. I set the mug down, wiping my hands on a dish towel as I walked to the door. I didn't know who it could be, but I wasn't surprised when I opened it to find him standing there, looking as calm and collected as ever. His smile was warm, almost reassuring, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined the weight of everything. I thought I'd check in, he said, his voice low, steady. You doing okay? I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. It was strange how easily we fell into a rhythm, how natural it felt to have him here, even when everything else in my life was so uncertain. I couldn't explain it. I just knew that I didn't want him to leave. Not yet. Yeah, I said, though the word felt hollow. I'm okay. Just processing. He didn't say anything, but I saw the understanding in his eyes. We didn't need to talk about it. We both knew what was happening, what was already happening between us. There was no need to make it more complicated than it had to be. We sat down in the living room, and for a long while, we didn't speak. The weight of the silence was comfortable, familiar. It wasn't awkward, like it might have been with anyone else. With him, it was just easy. We were both processing, both carrying the same burden of unspoken things, and in some strange way, it felt like we were sharing that weight together. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but firm. You don't have to do this alone, you know. Whatever this is. I turned to face him, the words settling into my chest, heavy and true. He was right. I didn't have to do this alone. But the question was, what exactly was this? What was it that we were doing? And what would it mean when it all came to a head? I don't know what this is, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. You don't have to know, he said, his hand resting on the arm of the chair. Sometimes, it's okay to just be. To let things unfold without trying to control everything. I shook my head, unsure if I agreed or not. Letting go, giving up control, that wasn't something I was used to. I had spent my life controlling everything, trying to keep the pieces of my world in place, even when they were slipping away. But now, everything felt out of my control. I wasn't sure if I was ready for that, or if I ever would be. The conversation drifted from there, meandering from topic to topic, but neither of us truly saying anything of consequence. It was as though we were both waiting for the inevitable, but neither of us was brave enough to take the first step. The silence stretched on, comfortable and full of potential. I glanced at the clock on the wall, surprised to find how much time had passed. I had been so lost in the moment, so wrapped up in the quiet space between us, that I hadn't noticed the world moving around me. The day had slipped by, unnoticed and unimportant, as though it didn't matter. What mattered was here, in this room, with him. When he stood to leave, I felt the shift. The space between us, once full of tension, suddenly felt fragile. This wasn't just another conversation. This wasn't just another passing moment. This was something different. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. Take care of yourself, he said, his voice soft, as though he were leaving me with more than just words. Don't forget that you deserve more than just surviving. I nodded, unsure of what to say. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving me standing in the living room, alone with my thoughts. The door clicked shut behind him, and I was left with nothing but the silence of the house. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I couldn't ignore them. I couldn't ignore what he had said. I had spent my life surviving, but I wasn't sure I knew how to live anymore. I walked back into the kitchen, staring at the coffee cup that still sat on the counter, now cold. I had finished it earlier, but I hadn't really tasted it. I hadn't really tasted anything for a long time. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do now. I wasn't sure what came next. But I knew one thing for certain, things were changing. And I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I didn't have a choice. The question now wasn't whether I could keep pretending. It was whether I could finally start living. The days after our last conversation passed in a slow blur, each moment stretched out in front of me like a never-ending line. I couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness that had settled in my chest. It was as though everything I had known, everything I had accepted, had started to unravel, bit by bit. And no matter how hard I tried to grasp onto the things I thought were secure, my marriage, my home, my sense of self, it felt like the thread was slipping through my fingers. I tried to bury it. I buried it in the tasks I had always done, the laundry, the cooking, the cleaning. The small rituals that used to bring me a sense of order now felt empty, like I was performing actions without purpose. There was no satisfaction in it anymore. It was just a way to fill the silence. I spent the evenings watching my husband come home, his face tired and distant as he slid into his usual chair in the living room. The television was always on, but neither of us really watched it. It was just noise. We were two people living in the same house, existing in parallel without ever really connecting. On the days when he was at work, I found myself wandering aimlessly through the house, restless and unsure. There were moments when I considered leaving, just driving away and not coming back. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to make that decision. It wasn't that I loved my husband any less, it was that I had lost the person I had once been, the woman who could make decisions without hesitation, without fear. The phone rang one afternoon, breaking the stillness. I didn't recognize the number, but I picked up anyway. Hello? Hi, it's me. His voice was familiar, and even though he hadn't said his name, I knew exactly who it was. I closed my eyes, leaning back against the counter as I let the sound of his voice fill the space around me. Hi, I said, my voice almost too soft. I didn't want to admit how much I had been waiting for this call. How are you? He asked, the question simple but carrying a weight I couldn't ignore. I'm fine, I answered, though it felt like a lie, even as I said it. The word felt foreign in my mouth. I wasn't fine. I wasn't sure what I was. I've been thinking about you, he said. I've been thinking about everything we've talked about. My heart skipped a beat. And what have you decided? I asked, though I wasn't sure if I was asking about him, about me, or about both of us. I don't know, he said after a pause. But I know that what's been happening between us, it's not something I can just walk away from. And I don't think you can either. The silence between us was thick, filled with so many unspoken words. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell him that he was right, that I couldn't keep pretending. Another part of me wanted to pull away, to go back to the life I had known, even if it meant staying in a marriage that no longer felt like my own. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, I finally admitted. I don't know how to make sense of all this. He was quiet for a long moment. Neither do I. But we don't have to figure it all out right now. I nodded, even though I knew he couldn't see me. I don't know if I can keep pretending, I said again, more to myself than to him. You don't have to, he said softly. But don't make any decisions just yet. We're both in a tough place right now, but we don't have to go through it alone. I stayed quiet for a moment, my thoughts racing. Part of me wanted to hold on to what was familiar, to return to the routine of my life, no matter how empty it had become. But another part of me knew that I couldn't ignore the changes inside me, the way I felt alive again when I was with him, when we talked, when we simply existed together. Maybe we can meet up tomorrow, he suggested. Just talk. No pressure. I think we both need some space to figure things out. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. I didn't know if I wanted to fix anything or if I was just looking for something different, something that made me feel alive again. I hung up the phone and stood there for a long time, staring out the kitchen window at the empty yard. The world outside was quiet, still, but I felt like everything inside me was shifting, rearranging. I didn't know what was going to happen next. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with the feelings that had been awakened. The thought of meeting him the next day filled me with both dread and anticipation. Part of me wanted to run, to ignore everything and try to piece my life back together in the way I had known it. But the other part of me, the part that had been dormant for so long, knew that I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions of my usual routine. When my husband came home, he was distracted, lost in his own thoughts. He kissed me on the cheek, like he always did, but it felt different now. His touch seemed distant, almost mechanical, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both just going through the motions, pretending to be something we were no longer. I went to bed that night feeling restless. I didn't sleep well, my thoughts swirling with confusion and uncertainty. In the darkness of the room, I wondered what would happen if I went through with it, if I met him, if we talked, if we admitted to ourselves what had been building between us. Would it change everything? Could I walk away from the life I had built, the life that no longer felt like mine? When morning came, I felt no clearer. I had made no decisions, but the weight of everything hung on me. I got dressed, had a quick breakfast, and then left the house, driving to the cafe where we had agreed to meet. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I didn't know why. I wasn't sure if I was nervous, excited, or just tired of pretending that nothing had changed. He was already there when I arrived, waiting at a small table in the corner. He looked up as I approached, his face softening when he saw me. I sat down across from him, but neither of us spoke right away. The air between us felt thick with everything we hadn't said yet. Finally, he broke the silence. "I don't know what we're doing," he said. "But I know that I can't just walk away from this. From you." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I don't know if I can either," I said quietly. "But I can't keep pretending." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally being honest with myself. The morning after our conversation was quieter than usual, though the stillness felt different. It wasn't the emptiness that I had grown used to over the past few months, the kind of silence that signified a lack of connection. No, this was a different kind of quiet, a charged one, pregnant with possibility. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break free. I woke early, before the sun had fully risen, and I stood by the window for a long time, staring out at the world that had somehow become foreign to me. The sky was still dark, the only light coming from the soft glow of the streetlights, casting long shadows across the yard. The world was asleep, and so was my husband. I had barely noticed him leave earlier that morning, as I had been lost in my own thoughts, consumed by the weight of everything that had happened. It wasn't that I didn't love him anymore, it was that I couldn't ignore how distant we had become. The connection between us had frayed so quietly, I hadn't noticed it until it was too late. I stood there for what felt like hours, just thinking, trying to make sense of everything. I had always been someone who needed certainty, who sought structure and control. But now, I was adrift. There was no map, no guide for where I was heading, only the faint, uncertain pull of something I couldn't fully understand. The meeting with him, the cousin, the unspoken connection between us, it was all so complicated, so overwhelming. I didn't know what to do with any of it. Eventually, I went downstairs, my movements automatic. The house was still, almost too still. I set the coffee brewing and walked to the living room, where I sat on the couch, staring at the empty space in front of me. The walls seemed to close in around me. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the corner of the room, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and yet everything felt dead silent. It wasn't that I regretted what had happened, what was happening between us. It was that I didn't know how to make it stop, or if I even wanted it to. The problem wasn't the kiss, or the growing connection that we had, no, the problem was what came after. The consequences of it all. What would my life look like now? What would my marriage look like now? What kind of person would I be after all of this? I stood up suddenly, my mind racing. I couldn't stay in this house anymore, not in this limbo. I grabbed my purse, my phone, and left. The world outside felt different too, though I wasn't sure why. The streets, still quiet in the early morning light, felt almost like a different version of the place I had lived in for years. There was no clear reason to leave, no real destination in mind. I just needed to move, to break free from the weight of my own thoughts. I found myself driving toward the park, a place I hadn't visited in years. The trees were bare now, their branches stretching like twisted arms toward the sky. It felt strangely fitting, the emptiness of the place reflecting the emptiness I had been feeling. I parked the car and got out, walking toward the benches that lined the path, each one offering a different view of the barren landscape. I sat down and closed my eyes for a moment, trying to center myself, trying to find something solid to hold on to. But my mind kept drifting back to him. The kiss. The way he had looked at me, the way he had made me feel like I was still alive, like I still mattered in a world that had been shrinking around me. I had never expected it to be like this. I never expected to feel like this. But here I was, sitting in a park, unsure of what I was doing with my life or who I was becoming. After a while, I stood up again and started walking through the park, the cool air biting at my cheeks. My thoughts were still a tangle of confusion, but they were no longer as sharp, no longer as painful. I was walking, moving forward, and that was enough for now. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking when I heard a familiar voice calling my name. I turned, my heart leaping in my chest. There he was, standing at the entrance to the park, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. It wasn't like before, when I had been expecting him. This time, I hadn't known he would be here, and yet there he was, as if the world itself had conspired to bring him back into my life. "You came," he said, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I didn't know if you'd actually show up." "I wasn't sure if I would," I admitted, taking a step closer to him. I didn't know what I was doing, or what I was supposed to feel. He nodded, his gaze steady. "It's okay. We don't need to have all the answers. Not right now." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, I realized how much had changed in me. How much had shifted. The confusion, the guilt, the uncertainty, it was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy. I was no longer clinging to the life I had before, the one that had felt safe but suffocating. I was standing here with him, in this moment, and that was enough. "I don't know what comes next," I said, my voice quiet, but firm. "But I know I can't keep pretending." He stepped closer, his presence grounding me, offering me the space to breathe, to be. "Neither can I." We stood there for a moment, the world around us quiet, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees the only thing breaking the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence I had been used to. This silence was filled with possibility. With things unspoken, but understood. Finally, I spoke again, my voice steady. I think I need to take some time to figure things out. To understand what this is, what this all means." He didn't say anything right away, just nodded. "I understand. But you don't have to do it alone." I smiled then, a small, tentative smile. "I know." We stood there for a while longer, not saying anything, but not needing to. The silence now was a comfortable one, not one full of things left unsaid, but one filled with everything we hadn't yet put into words. Eventually, we walked back toward the car, the quiet company between us both reassuring and unsettling at the same time. I wasn't sure what the future held. I wasn't sure where this would lead. But in that moment, I realized that I didn't need to have it all figured out. For the first time in a long time, I was willing to just let things unfold. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward finding myself